Kadosh Boker or Masechet Gittin Daf Zayin Amud Aleph 27a1, starting the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Hamevi get ve'avad hemenu v'metzao le'altar kasher. The person's going to bring a get from one place to another place to divorce his wife, and then it got lost. Yeah, so the get got lost from the shaliach, but he found it immediately. Right? Kasher. It's going to be kasher still to use it. Meaning we're not going to suspect that it's another get. Right? He lost it. Immediately we're going to say it's kasher. But if he didn't find it immediately, but rather it was after a little bit of time, pasul. It's going to be pasul. Mitzao b'hafisa o b'diluskima. If he found it in different kelim, right? And then imakido, if you recognize the get, right? Even if he found it by itself, it's going to be kasher. Right? Why? Because at the end of the day, that means even if it got lost, it was placed in the utensil, and therefore you have like a siman in this keli, right? Or you recognize the actual get in itself, even though you found it by itself, it's going to be kosher. There's a Gemara. Or minhu, we have a contradiction. There's a stira, there's a contradiction to our Mishnah. Why? There's a Mishnah in Bab Metzia, Yudchet Amud Aleph. Matzah gittin nashim. So there's some get also. So imagine a person found a get of women, right? Or a liberation, emancipation letter, or daitiki. Daitiki is like a tzava'a, it's like a will of a shchiv mirah, right? Or matanot, or any other document of a present, giving over a present from one person to another one. Or shovarim. Shovarim means that you paid back a loan, okay? Hareze lo yachzir, you never give it back. Not to the one that belongs to, or not to the one that gave it, right? That means not to the husband, not to the woman, or if it's the master, the servant, or not. You don't give it back, right? He says, Shani Omer, because I'm going to say, Ketubina you, they were written, and they were all of a sudden, they changed their mind, that they didn't want to give it. They didn't want to give it. Ha Amar. But if right now the husband says, Tenula getze, that he's going to write, and then it fell, right? Notnim, we do give it, even for a long time, which means we're not going to suspect that it's another get. So this is a stira to our Mishnah. Our Mishnah, first of all, to do with all the other cases, we suspect maybe you just wrote it, but you decided not to give it. So why am I going to give it to somebody? If I'm going to give it to somebody, it's a problem. Mitzad Sheni, to do with the get nashim, if he went and he said, give this get to the wife that I went in, and then it fell from me, right? So then we do give it. But even if it's mamrubeh, by our Mishnah, it was only written that it was only going to be for a very small amount of time. If you found it immediately, then you give it back. But if it's going to be kosher, but if it's going to be that you found it after a long time, it's not good. Here it's mashma, it's still going to be okay. So mamrubeh means a long time. Again, we didn't get into what is long time, short time, but at least meaning a long time and short time was there. So Amar Rabba comes and he answers. La kashya, it's not a question. You know what are we dealing with? Which means our Mishnah is talking about where the get got lost in a place where there's a lot of shayirot, which they come back and forth. And therefore, if it's going to be found after a long time, I'm going to suspect that maybe it came from somebody else. Yeah, it's not the original get that fell from the shaliach, and it's pasul to do it, to divorce with it. But the Mishnah b'Metzia, there was nobody that comes around. So therefore, even if it's going to be after a long time, it belongs to them, which means like this. I'm going to give you an example. Right? We live in Miami. So in Miami, there's a lot of people coming back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So if you find something in Miami, it's not a proof that it belongs to the residents of Miami. It could have been from anybody else. It could have been from whoever it is. Doesn't matter, right? But when we're going to be talking about, let's say, a small village, yeah, a small little tiny village in Honolulu, I don't know where. So therefore, obviously, if it's there, even if it's after a long time, it's still probably the people of residence, because you don't have that many people coming back, forth. That. So therefore, it probably is the same one, the same get from the beginning. That's how the Gemara answers a stira. Okay, so our Mishnah is talking about like a metropolis, which people are coming back and forth and back at train station, right? Train station. Yeah, a train station, or even a city, which is like a metropolis, a big city that people are just coming back and forth. There are tons of tourists, and therefore, since there's so many tourists, I'm going to suspect they're really be'emet, right? It comes from there. Okay, fine. Says the Gemara, "Vafilu b'makom she'asheriyot, right? Metziyot, yeah, right." He comes and he says this, and even in a place where the shayirot are metziyot, what does it mean shayirot metziyot? That the wagons or the caravans they're common. Vehu You know what happens? It's adding on to Rabba. And it's saying that we are going to suspect to another get, but that's Dafka if there's going to be two Yosef ben Shimons in the same city, which means that we know that there's somebody else that also has the same name as the husband and the same name as the wife. But not only just the same name, it has to be the same name and their father. Because you could have, right, two different people with the same name, right? And you have it over there, right? So for example, you have, let's say you have two Ronens Bar Shlomo.
There is.
Yeah, so you have it. What does that mean? You have two people that are the same name as Ronen Bar Shlomo. Okay? Now, especially if we don't write Kohen, right, in the get, because there's Shitot that you don't write Kohen in the get, right? That means even though the person, we don't write down additives, meaning like we don't write down different names or nicknames or anything like that. We don't write down. There's a whole machloket, do we add in Kohen or not, right? But fine. So now what happens is if you had two people with the same name, and then you have two people that their wives also have to be the same name. So it has to be Rivka Batsara, right? But it has to be the same names, meaning not just, right, Mordechai, right? It has to be Mordechai Bar Amram. It cannot just be, right, it has to be, right, Masud. It has to be the same name and father's name. That's the way that we read it in the get. So same thing with the woman. It has to be Rivka Batsara. It can't just be two Rivkas, but two Rivkas, you can have millions of Rivkas. But one's Batsara and one's Batrachel. You understand? It has to be the same names. So if you have a chazakah that you have both of them the same name, so then we are going to suspect that maybe it came from somebody else. But if we do not know that there's another person with the same name, so then really be'emet, we're not going to say that there was somebody else like that, because it's too far away to say such a thing. Because if you're not going to say this, kasha de Rabba. So then you're going to have a contradiction between Rabba and Rabba in himself. And the Gemara is going to explain, right, what was the story? Why? Right? He says over like this. He says, Dahu Gita, Dishtakach Bedina de Ravuna. But there was a get that got lost. And the get with these names was found in the Bedina of Ravuna. Right? Vavaktiv, and it was written in it, Bishvide, Mata de Al-Rachis Nahara. In the city of Shvide, which is the city, right, which is on Nahar Rachis, which means even the city, by the way, we always write the city with some coordinates. Usually there's a minhag even to write it with two different coordinates, which means that they don't just write down, for example, Miami Beach, right? What do? They write down Miami Beach, which is Yoshevet al Mei Beirot, right? Meshluchim Mei Beirot, right? You have, for example, in Yerushalayim, Meshiloach, right? Meborot, things that, which means that you're going to come and you're going to say that it's on the sea, or it's on by a certain river, or that it's by a certain place. Why? Because you want to know the coordinates of the city, right? Even nowadays, by the way, right? Nowadays,
Same name for two.
exactly. For example, London. There's London, England, and there's London in America. Look up in London. There's London, America. Now, you're right. In America, let's say nowadays you would write down Artzot Habrit, right? Yeah.
Yes, Yerushalayim.
No, it must be.
Is the minhag here in the footnote? It actually brings down the minhag. Is to write in the get Shema Nahara Samuch La'id. Right, that was the minhag. So that's why he says they found the get that it was written Shvide, a city which is on Rachis Nahara. The Amar Ravuna says Choshil Shne Shvide. We're going to suspect that there's going to be two Shvides, and maybe there's a person that has two different names, his name and like the wife's name, and from him fell. The Elmaleh Rav Chasa Rabba. So says Rav Chasa to Rabba, right? He says Tukvayimba, right? Go look into it. We're going to ask this from Ravuna. We're going to ask him, right? Do we suspect that there's two shvides and things like that? Nafak dak ve'ashkach. He went out and he found the raya. The tzanam, as we learned in a Mishnah b'Metzia, kol maaseh bedin areze yachzir. If somebody finds a shtar that was done in bedin, for example, let's say a shtar chov that has a kiyum of bedin, right, which means that it has the the yishur, right, of the bedin, right? They could actually give it back to the person, because since it's already validated, we're not going to suspect that maybe he retracted or he didn't give it or all those things. If it's validated from the bedin, that's it. So it comes out. We're not going to suspect that there's going to be two different cities of Shvire. So says the Gemara, 1 second. The Habe Dina de Ravuna, the V'chmom She'erot Metziot Dami, the Kapashit Yachzir. 1 second. There, it was a place where there's a lot of caravans going back and forth. And still we said, give it back to them. But 1 second. If there's a whole bunch of caravans, maybe by Met, right? It came from somewhere else. Alma, so you see from here, if there was a chazakah that there was two Yosef and Shimon in the same city, then yes. But if not, then we're not going to suspect it. Okay? So therefore, that's why we said it. So now the Gemara is going to say, what's a psak halacha? Avad Rabba uvda behu gita dishtachach bekitna. So Rabbi, he did the action. He was pasak halacha with a get that was found in beta pishtan, which we're going to explain. What does this mean? Beta pishtan? It's bekitna. Kitna is kutna, right? So he says bepumpadita, right, which was in pumpadita, and he says kishmate, exactly what it was, which means a what? That we're not going to suspect if there's going to be two people that are going to have the two names and the two days. So that we're not going to suspect that. Some people say the taru kitna. Some people say it's a place that they come and they soak the pishtan, the flax, right? And therefore there's not a lot of people there because that's where they're coming and they're doing this, right? So he says, right, right? Now even though there's going to be a chazakah, the lo shchichan shayrata, right? That there was not found the shayrot mitzuyot, right? So he says that means even though there's a chazakah that they did have two people with the same name, but there's not a lot of people coming back and forth. Let's look where they are, right? And some people say we're talking about a place where they're selling kutna, okay? Right? But he says, and therefore there, where do they sell kutna? In a shuk, in a marketplace. So if there are a lot of people there. But there was no chazakah that you have two people with the same names there. But there is very common people to have that. So if a rabbi was posek to give it back, because according to his shita, in a place where there's no two people with the same name, we're not going to suspect that it came from somewhere else. Okay? Fine. Now we're going in the following. Rabbi Zera Rami Matzniti Nabraita Umeshani. Rabbi Zera, he's going to ask, right, a question from a Mishnah on a Braita, right, and he's going to answer it as follows. Tanan, we learned on a Mishnah. Hamevi get v'avadamin. Imagine right now you're the shaliach. You're bringing the get and it got lost, right? So our Mishnah says if you found it immediately, it's going to be kasher. And if you didn't find it immediately, it's going to be pasul. Or minu, we have a contradiction. This was the Tosefta and B'Metzia, Matzah get isha b'shuk. If you found the get isha in the shuk, Bizman shabal modeh, if the husband agrees that he said that he's going to give her a get, Nachzir isha, give it back to the woman, right? Which means in the olden days, the woman actually kept her get. Nowadays, minhag was that they don't keep the get. Why? Because we don't want them to find a psul in the get, right? And then they're going to say, it wasn't a good get. So therefore, nobody keeps the get. But in the olden days, she actually had her get. What? Yeah, that's the reason. Yeah, that's the reason. Yeah. So therefore, right? You're right. But in the olden days, right? She kept it. They didn't do it in the olden days, right? You give it back to the woman. But if the husband does not agree that she gave a get, don't give it back to anybody. Right? Don't give it back not to the husband, right? Because keilu, maybe he already gave it, and not to the woman, because maybe he didn't give it yet. Right? So now what's going to happen? So he says, mashma, bizman, 27b, bizman shabal modemiat, but if the husband does agree, you do give it back to the woman, even if it was after a long time, meaning we're not going to come and suspect maybe it's another get, but rather we're going to give it back to her, even though it's after a long time. We said in our Mishnah that it's only if it was immediately, but it's after a long time. No, here it's written mashma even after a long time. But he answered what we answered before. It all depends. Our Mishnah is talking about where there's a lot of people coming back and forth. And therefore, maybe it came from somebody else. So if it was after a long time, I'm going to suspect it came from somebody on the path. Somebody was traveling, and on the way, they dropped the get. Right? And it happened to be the same names of the man and the woman, right? And that's it. So he says, but here we're talking about a case where there wasn't a lot of people passing by. So even if it was after a long time, I'm still going to say it was the same people. There are those that say, but that's only if there was a chazakah that the two Yosefs ben Shimons in the city, then you can't give it back. And that's a shita of Rabba that we said above, which means according to shitat Rabba, when you have a chazakah of two people with the same names in the city, we're not going to come and suspect, right? That's what he's saying over here, like that we're not going to suspect that the get came from even after a long time, not even only with these two conditions. You have two people plus shayrot mitzuyot. Okay, fine. And some people say, even though there's no chazakah to Yosef and Shimon's in the city, you're not going to give it back. And this argues on Rabba. Like why? Because it comes out that Rabbi Zera, she argues on Rabba, because he holds that if there's no chazakah, we're not going to suspect to another get. And here, even right, it has to be dafka according to Rabba if it was husiku. Okay, fine. Bishlema de Rabba lo amar Rabbi Zera. I understand Rabba does not hold like Rabbi Zera. Because remember, according to Rabba, it Dafka had to have a chazakah that the two people with the same name. Why? Matzniti nalima le'lakshuye, because a Mishnah is better, is stronger than a Braita. Meaning, remember, what's stronger, a Mishnah or a Braita? A Mishnah is stronger. A Mishnah came from Rabbi, right? The Braitot were that which were left out. They were not brought in the Mishnayot. But according to Rabbi Zera, why doesn't he hold like Rabba? So Rabbi Zera is going to answer you, Miktani, does it say, does it say in there in the Braita or the Mishnah there, that if he said, yeah, give it, then you're going to give it even if it was after a long time? Maybe it meant that if he says, yeah, give it means you have to give it, but it was only if it was found immediately, not after such a long time, right? Which means that why are you saying such a thing? It doesn't say Zman Merubeh. So if it's going to be found for Zman Merubeh, we are going to suspect for another get, for that it came from somewhere else. And therefore, it's not a question from the Braita. So therefore, Rabbi Zera, he says, what's the problem? I could be according to everybody. Nobody has ever said it against me. Rabbi Yirmiyah comes and he says, Kigon de kamri yadim me'olam lo chatamnu ela get echad shel ben Shimon. You know how you could come and have another case where there's no question, not from the Mishnah, not from the Braita? The witnesses. I find the two witnesses that were signed on the get, and I bring them in. And I tell them, you guys were the witnesses? These are your signatures? Yes. Okay, so this is your signatures. Yes, 100%. You signed on this get? Yes. Did you ever sign another get? He said, yeah, we've signed on many gets, but never did we sign on another get that was Yosef ben Shimon. That means the only one that had these two names was this get. So therefore, the witnesses are saying it. So we're not going to suspect now of something else. And that's what Rabbi Yirmiyah comes and he says. So says the Gemara, so what's the chidush? Obviously, look how many things you have to have in place. You need two Yosef ben Shimons. You need two Rivka's bat Saras, right? You need two of them in the same place, right? Then you're going to need two of the same witnesses. Now, the witnesses are telling you that we never signed another get with the same name. So therefore, we still do it.
Okay, so that's it. So they never signed another get with the same name.
So what's a chidush? So I would have thought to say, I would have thought to say that maybe everything was the same. His name was like his name, her name is like her name, the edim are the same edim. No, that's already too far. You need to start suspecting that it came from somewhere else, and then I had the same name of Yosef ben Shimon, the same name of Rivka bat Sarah, and the same name of the edim and the edim. That's already like, wow, like that's already too much. We don't suspect this.
In the medical files.
So Ravashi comes and he says, Ravashi Amar, Kegon de Kamar, for example, he comes and he says, Nekev yeshbo betzad ot plonit, tehavele siman muvhak. Nowadays, by the way, they still do this. Nowadays, many times they'll come and they'll make a hole by a letter. Not in the letter, because that could make a pasul, obviously, by a letter. So, for example, let's say there's a letter Hey. So they'll come and they'll make a pinhole. Mamash a pinhole. They'll ask. Rabbi Sandaravich will come and ask, can I have a pin? You give him a pin. Whoops, one. Sometimes they'll even do three. They'll come, they'll make a little tiny hole. No, meaning, for example, let's say they're going to send the get to New York, right? How do you know it's the same get? So he's going to come and besides writing, obviously it's this name is the husband, this name is the wife, this is where it was written, this is the name of the deen. Besides that, they come and they write. It has a siman muvhak that there's going to be a hole or two holes or three holes, whatever it is, by this letter on the first line. And by doing that, when they receive it, they come, they check it. We found it. This is the right letter. So Ravashi comes and he says there's a little hole, and that's a siman muvhak. The davka betzad ot ploni, but that's only by a certain letter. Davle siman muvhak, because that's a siman muvhak. Aval nekebam, but just stam a hole, and it's not written where the hole is. That's not a siman muvhak. No. So mesafkale. So there's a doubt by simanim. Do you give it back al pi simanim or not? Idoraita, is it doraita? Or is it going to be drabbanan? Okay, that's why if it's going to be a siman muvhak, meaning a siman that there's a hole by this letter, that's much more precise. It's just say there's a hole. You come and you say, there's a hole. It could be very easy if there's a hole in a get. But to say that there's a hole by this letter, that's much more of a siman. Rabbi Barachana ilchas legitam bemidrash. So Rabbi Barachana, he lost the get, right? And it was found in the Bet Midrash. He lost it in the Bet Midrash, and he found the Bet Midrash. Amar, he says, isimana itli begave, itviut ina itli begave. If you guys want, I have the tviut time, right? Which means that I've got my eyesight on it, or I've got a siman on it. They give it back to him, which means that he says, if you want, I've got tviut time, because that I know, meaning he knows his get, or he's got also a siman. Amar, right? Rabbi Machana came in after afterwards. I don't know if they give it back to him because of the siman, because they hold siman adoraita, or because of tviutena, because they recognize it, right? And that's why they give it back to him, not because of the siman, but rather because he recognizes it. Only because he's a big rabbi. But not anybody else. Meaning, there's two different things. Tviutena means many times you could see a talit and say, "This is my talit." 1 second. How do you know? Do you have a siman? Do you have your initials written on it? That's a siman. Right? Do you have? Or you just say, no. This is what I see. I know this is mine. Why? I know. The stain, the this, that. I know exactly. This is mine. So that's called tviyut ena. Tviyut ena means teva ayin, right? Meaning my eye. This is mine. I know it. But then there's something which is called a siman. What's a siman? I wrote Daled Aleph, right, on the bottom. So it's a siman. That's David al-Maliyah. I already know it's there. So it's a siman. So he comes and he says, we don't know why they give it back to him. Did they give it back to him because of the siman? And therefore siman is doraita. But it wasn't a siman muvhak. It's siman muvhak for sure, right? But he says, is it because of siman doraita, or because it's yutain? To yutain, they're only going to reply upon because he's a big rabbi. But maybe if it's a regular person, they're not going to give it back to him. Fine. Next, 2 dots. The love pasul. Now we said if you found it immediately, it's going to be kosher. It's going to be after a little bit of time. It's going to be pasul. Doesn't mean that it wasn't immediate. Now we're trying to define what is immediately and what's not immediately. That's what we're going to try to do.
First, it depends on the caravan.
So he comes and he says like this. He says, Tanu Rabbanan, Ezu Shalol Altar. What does it mean Shalol Altar? Rabbi Natan says, Sheshata Kedesh Ta'avor She'era V'Tichle. Enough time that another caravan will be able to come and will stay there. That's already considered, right, that it's not going to be l'altar. That's the first shita. Second shita, Shalol Lazar Omer, in order that a person should see, right, that nobody else passed by there. That means from the time that the shliach went by until the next time, that's already enough. Some people say third shita, nobody passed by and stayed there. Rabbi, the fourth shita says, the time that it takes to write a get. Fifth shita, Rabbi Yitzchak Omer, in order to read the get. Now, reading the get and writing the get is not the same thing, obviously. Right, 6 shita, acharim omrim, kedei lekotvo v'likroto. No. To write it and read it. So, by the way, I don't know if you realize, every single one of these have completely different shitot. You understand? Meaning, like every single one is completely different, right? Because obviously, we're talking about the different. This whole right, the caravan, the time of the caravan that nobody else passed by, nobody else walked by, right? Write it and get the full get. Yes, write the full get, right? Or to read the entire get, or to read and to write, right? But all these things.
The word you were looking for yesterday was template.
Shaha. So now, even if the get was longer this time than this, yeshvu simanim midim alav. The simanim are going to make a kosher. The Amni Bazika says, Neked yeshbo b'tzadot klonim. Because you could say a siman muvak, if there's a certain hole, that means basically all this that we're talking about was that there was no siman muvak. If there was a siman muvak by saying there's a dot, there's a hole by this letter, that's already going to be enough that it's going to be no problem. Okay? Ve'en mi'idin al simanei aguf, and we're not going to testify about simanei aguf. The amar aroch ve'gus, that we're going to say it's long or it's short, meaning we're not going to come and say, 1 second. The get is long, the get is short. Because all the gittin, there could be long ones, there could be short ones, there could be this, that. That's not a proof. Okay? Fine. What happens if you find the get, that it was going to be tied, whether it's going to be to a money pouch, or to a wallet, or to a tabat, or all these things, right? Or shematzao, kavchet amud aleph. We're going to go to the Mishnah, right? 28a. Or shematzao ben kelav, or he found it in his house. Afilu lizmam rubev, it's going to be a long time. Kasher, it's going to be kasher. Why? Because for sure it was from him and not from somebody else. But that's why it's by his utensils, right? And it didn't come from somebody else, right? The same person. It was stated. Rabbi Yehuda says, "Halacha is shelo shaha adam sham." Halacha is that nobody else was there, which is the third shita that we mentioned above them, right? Rabbi Yochannan's name of Rabbi Yishmael says, "Halacha is shelo abar sham adam." Nobody else actually went there, so that's the second shita in the Braita. So says the Gemara, "Lemo mor halacha kemor, mor halacha kemor." So why don't we just say one of them should have said that halacha was like whatever his name was? What was the third one? The second one, the third one, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, or like Yeshomrim. Well, why do we just say the name? So he says, no, Mishun Dapchelu, because sometimes they change the names. Meaning sometimes you're going to think that, John Paul says A, and then Michelle said B. The others, no, but Michelle said A and he said B. So, you know what, don't say, just say, this is halacha, this is halacha, the case, instead of saying who says what. Okay? Fine, the last two dots. If you found it in a keli, my chafisa, what is chafisa? It's like a small sackcloth, right, of a small sackcloth of ore, of the skins. My deluskema, what is deluskema? Tlika de sabe. It's a zakasaj zekenim. But they come and they put their things in order that they don't have to look for them. So they all put them in like a little tiny bags, like they always have it. Those are the utensils that we have. We continue with Hashem tomorrow from the